Okay, thank you very much, and welcome. I must apologize in advance for speaking to you in English instead of in Spanish. I started learning Spanish about a month ago in preparation for this trip, but I'm a bit too nervous to use it as of yet. But afterwards, perhaps over drinks or something like that, a nice rioja or whatever, we can discuss further in Spanish. Okay, my talk is going to be a little bit unconventional, I'd say, not least because you're here for the free market roadshow, and I don't personally have a lot to say about that. I'm not an economist by training. I'm actually an historian, so it'll be a little bit peculiar, not just in terms of content, but also somewhat in terms of approach. I'd like to start with a tale that some of you may know, and if so, probably the sort of thing that you haven't heard about or read about since grade school. And that's called The Tale of Mycalessus. This is from a text by the Greek historian Thucydides called The History of the Peloponnesian War, which you may ring some bells from many, many years ago. Now, this war was fought from 431 BC to 404 BC between Athens and its various allied city-states on the one hand, and Sparta and her various allied city-states on the other hand. At one point during the war, the Athenians, in their hubris, in their pride, decide to go over into Sicily, this disastrous Sicilian expedition. They end up having to leave with their tail between their legs. They end up having to retreat back to Athens. It's a failure. But along the way back, they encounter a little town called Mycalessus. Now, Mycalessus, there's absolutely nothing noteworthy about it. It's actually a strange town that Thucydides mentions in the middle of this expedition. But he mentions it, I think, for a very specific purpose. Because on the way back, they passed through this town, and the Athenians could no longer afford to pay the mercenaries, their Thracian mercenaries. And so they told them, well, look, we can't pay you, so why don't you just pillage and rob whatever you can find on your way back home? And unfortunately for the Mycalessians, they found this town, Mycalessus. Mycalessus thought that it was insulated from the war, that it was somehow unaffected by it. They had long ago gotten rid of their city walls, and Thucydides writes movingly of how there was a school for young boys, and they happened to be learning something at the time, maybe philosophy or some such thing. And the Thracians came through and massacred every student in this school, amongst many of the other men, women, and children in Mycalessus, before returning back to their home. There are three lessons, at least, from this tale. One is that war develops a logic of its own. We didn't need the great Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz to tell us that, but it's a useful reminder that sometimes war can grow beyond the boundaries of politics and become particularly savage. Thus is indeed the case, as we've seen in the news for the last few days, that the Russians have been accused of war crimes in Kiev as they're withdrawing. That's the first lesson. War develops a logic of its own. The second lesson is that Europe, I think, perhaps up until this moment, I think is a little bit like the Mycalessians, content to look inward, deal with their own problems, or not deal with their own problems even inwardly, as it were, and to assume that they needn't concern themselves with foreign policy. They can always rely on the American defensive umbrella. And in this sense, to me, they seem to be a bit like Mycalessus. And the third lesson from this tale, at least in the context of this talk, is directly related to the purpose of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, which is what he called a work for all time. He thought that it was a work for all time because Thucydides thought that human nature and the fundamental passions that move us were consistent throughout all time. Now, this was a lesson that had been appreciated by a great many writers, thinkers, politicians throughout the ages, such as Tacitus, the Roman historian, such as Machiavelli, the political theorist, through to the U.S. founding fathers and into the 19th century. Curiously, it's something that seems to have been forgotten, and I think that has something to do with the tragedy of the 19th century and the peace that it enjoyed, paradoxically. In 1815, as many of you will know, the Congress of Vienna concluded the terrible Napoleonic Wars. And for nearly an entire century, Europe was, in terms of large-scale interstate rivalry, it was at peace. You had smaller things. You had, of course, smaller revolutions in 1848. You had Prussia consolidating its position, taking Schleswig-Holstein, the war against Austria in 1866, and, of course, the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 to 71, culminating in the unification of Germany, which changed the balance of power in Europe forever. But for the most part, the entire continent, in terms of a large continent-wide war, was at peace. And it was one of the tragedies of that peace, paradoxically, that by the time 1914 came around, there was nobody alive who remembered what war was actually really like. And so when 1914 came around, it seemed obvious that it would be, the troops would be home for Christmas, as they said. Well, little did they know. They set off, you could call it a 30 years crisis, going through 2 world wars and ultimately resolved with the deus ex machina of American involvement, which persists to this day. Now, since that point, it seems like Europe more or less has been at peace. It's been focused on growth. It's been focused on the European Union and those sorts of things, which are all nice and important too. And yet, this year, just over a month ago, war has returned to the old continent, and it's forced us to reevaluate some of our nostrums here on the continent. So this is the first illusion that hopefully will have been punctured by this particular war that's happening right now. Although I never put it past our politicians and people's short attention spans that one day we might, in the near future, we might actually not learn any lessons from this. But my hope is that we do, and that we see that the first illusion is that war is obsolete. We live at a similar time, it's been noted by many scholars, to that which immediately preceded the First World War, a time of globalization and whatnot, economic interdependency. You had scholars such as Norman Angell, who wrote a work, I believe it was just the year prior to the outset of the First World War, so 1913, called The Grand Illusion, the idea that economic interconnectedness had made war obsolete. That is definitively not the case, not now, and I'm of the opinion that it never will be the case. War, I believe, is a social phenomenon, and we will always find ways to conduct it against each other. The question then is not the elimination of it, but rather how do we limit it? So that's the first illusion, the idea that war is obsolete. And even the Germans seem, a few days into the war, to have recognized this. We know Olaf Scholz declared that they would start to meet finally their NATO obligations, 2% of GDP to defense, which is interesting because if they actually do that, their contribution to defense will be almost as much as that of Britain and France combined. I wonder, I do not know how to address this, but I wonder what this will do to the balance of power in Europe. For a long time, you've had France upholding the political, diplomatic weight in Europe, and then Germany more the military might. But it may be the case that Germany will take on a more prominent role. The second illusion that I think this war should puncture concerns energy and environment, and I won't say too much about that because I know that Luis will probably go into that as well. Just on the way over here from the hotel, I was looking at my phone and there was a little nice little breaking news from the BBC. There's always a breaking news every hour or so. You all know that, I'm sure, right? About the UN calling for drastic change when it comes to combating climate change and that sort of thing. I mean, there's always need for drastic change to combat climate change, apparently. And it's worth, I think, reflecting on the fact that this probably has a lot of these calls to combat climate change probably have less to do with climate change than to do with some sort of ingrained prejudice against particular industries or against capitalism as such. Because it's worth reflecting that if the EU is to meet its net zero contributions by 2050, short of, coming up with some amazing technology or something, which can always happen, but if they're to meet those obligations, they would have to have a GDP per capita of India. That means going down from $37,000 to $2,000. It requires changes, as I think people who are honest about this debate are willing to admit, not just in using more solar or wind or things like that, but fundamentally reducing our consumption. And I think, though, the problem here is that when it comes to this particular war, people could go either way on this. It's clear that Europe is rather dependent on Russia for certain essential energies. Germany, for example, imports some 35% of its oil from Russia, 70% of its gas. The EU as a whole, I believe, is about 25% and 40% respectively. Now, some people, the environmentalists, might on the one hand say, well, this is a sign that we need more independence, we need to double down on green forms of energy. But I don't think that that's going to work at any point in the near future, and especially not at the cost. Or you might get some people on the other end saying, well, we need to have more energy realism. Now, what could that possibly mean? Well, it could mean becoming a bit more comfortable with nuclear, for example. It could also mean looking for gas from other sources than Russia. However, in all honesty, if I'm to speak of realism, I must look at the other side of that coin because we can't go too far in the opposite direction. I was reading an article the other day in the Wall Street Journal where the journalist was interviewing some CEOs from various American firms who were saying that actually they've maxed out their productive capacity. And there's only so many LNG import facilities here in Europe. Many of them located right here in Spain. But then, of course, the problem is you need to get pipelines to get it to eastward. And the people who need it most are all the way over in Eastern Europe. So there are certain logistical problems. There's surely certain regulatory problems. I'm not sure off the top of my head how long it takes to approve and build a pipeline here in Europe or in the United States for that matter. But these things take a while. So it seems clear that Russian energy cannot be fully replaced immediately. And I think the same sort of thing in terms of taking a more realistic view of energy matters goes for the U.S. as well. The U.S., since Barack Obama, has repeatedly talked of a sort of a pivot to Asia. Asia's where the action's at. Europe no longer. We want to get out of the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. But it keeps getting sucked back in to European affairs and into the Middle East. What was the first thing that one of the first things that Biden did after this broke out and oil prices are going through the roof? He went to Saudi Arabia. He didn't go to Saudi Arabia, but he asked if MBS would increase production, and he was politely or not so politely refused. So the U.S. will probably, in some respects, have to continue to be involved with certain dictatorships that they otherwise want to distance themselves from. And then, of course, lest we forget, we must always have more than half an eye on China in any discussion on geopolitics, because surely they're watching what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, just as Taiwan is, concerned about, well, how is the Western world reacting, and would China be able to take Taiwan? What would the repercussions of that be? This is a whole debate unto itself. I won't get into it, but I will say, simply because we're the Free Market Roadshow and we enjoy speaking openly and saying uncomfortable things, that my suspicion, which cannot, of course, be said very openly, is that at some point the Western world is going to have to come to grips with the fact that Taiwan will be lost to China, whether it be due to economic assimilation or to aggression. The fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, it means so much more to China than it does to us. And the cases are not even entirely comparable. Anyways, Ukraine was, at least if we talk about international law, was recognized by many more countries than Taiwan is, because if you recognize Taiwan as a country, then you invite castigation from China. Furthermore, we're talking about Ukraine and Russia because they're here in Europe on our back doorstep. Taiwan is not. It's a faraway land about which we know little. Finally, the third illusion, and so this has led some people to speak of the possibility that we're living in a second Cold War now, and that brings me to the third illusion, potentially an illusion. I actually, to be perfectly honest, haven't entirely made up my mind on this one, but it's worth debating. Are we dealing with another sort of scenario where this is the great, on the one side, you've got all of the great, the good fighters, the good side, liberalism and democracy, and on the other side, you've got the various forms of totalitarianism. I'm not really sure how constructive it is to engage in that sort of binary thinking. I mean, for one, you have other democracies, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, and most notably India, who either abstained in the UN vote to condemn Russia's aggression in Ukraine, or have chosen not to call out Putin for what he's been doing. So you have democracies who are not necessarily on the side of the West, or who don't even care, for that matter, who perhaps are more concerned with what's going on economically in their own countries than they are with Russia taking a portion of Europe into its orbit. Another component of this third illusion is that we probably will have to continue to make uncomfortable friendships in the future, cannot always insist on democracy, defending democracy absolutely everywhere, and even human rights, for that matter. Especially because that sort of thinking could further polarize the world into blocks. And it's not obvious that the authoritarian bloc, if you will, wouldn't get more support than the democratic bloc would. China, for example, is willing to buy up industries or put money into your country without saying anything about your internal regime. And yet, if we're too realist or too cynical, if this sounds too cynical for everybody here, to an extent it is. If we're too realist, we risk sacrificing those very values that make us who we are. So my presentation thus far has been beset with ambiguities, or if you want to be more negative about it, with confusion. I hope not confusion. I hope it's ambiguities. But that's because the reality I'm trying to investigate here is itself ambiguous. I've tried to lay out some of the antinomies, the paradoxes of political action. And that was something that the Greek historian I mentioned at the outset, Thucydides, was very familiar with indeed. And Thucydides, like the other great ancient thinkers, knew that navigating these ambiguities of political action required the ancient virtue known as prudence. Thank you very much.